Hello everyone. My name is Alex. And tonight I need you to do something for me before we even begin. I need you to stop whatever else you are doing right now. Put your phone down if you are multitasking. Close the other tabs. Turn on a light if you are sitting in the dark. Actually, turn on every light in the room if you can. Because what I am about to share with you over the next hour, these are not stories I wrote sitting at a desk with a cup of coffee trying to be creative. These are accounts from real people, real soldiers, real witnesses, people who experienced things so far beyond the edges of what they understood about the world, that carrying those experiences alone became impossible. They had to tell someone. Tonight, they are telling you 3 stories, 3 locations, 3 experiences that are going to crawl under your skin and nest there. And the reason I know that, the reason I am so certain of that, is because every single person who originally lived through these events, every single one of them, said the same thing afterward. They said, I cannot stop thinking about it. Not occasionally. Not when something triggers the memory. All the time. Every day. The way a song gets stuck in your head, except the song is something that happened to you in the dark and there is no amount of shaking your head that makes it go away. That is what these experiences do to people. And before we go any further, I want to share something with you. Something one of the witnesses said before he sat down and told us his story. He was a military veteran. 2 tours. A man who had seen things that most people cannot even imagine. And he looked straight into the camera. Calm, steady, the way soldiers learn to be calm and steady even when they are not, and he said, I did 2 tours in the Middle East. I have seen things that would break most people. Things I still dream about. Things I have spent years learning to carry without letting them carry me. But nothing in my entire military career, nothing in my entire life, scared me more than what I saw at that base on a cold November night. He paused. Because at least in war, the enemy is alive. Take a breath. Because we are going all the way to the end tonight and you are going to want to be settled for this. But before we begin, I want to take just a moment to say something to you. If you are new here, welcome. This channel exists because of people like you who find their way here in the middle of the night when they cannot sleep, or in the middle of the afternoon when they need something that reaches into a deeper part of them than their daily routine normally allows. We tell stories here. Real ones. And we tell them with the respect they deserve. If you are getting something from what we do here, if these stories matter to you the way they matter to us, please take 5 seconds right now and hit that subscribe button. Hit the like button. Hit the bell so you never miss an upload. We have got a lot more coming and you do not want to find out about it a week late from someone else's comment. And right now, right this second, drop where you are watching from in the comments below. What time is it where you are? Are you tucked under a blanket at 2 in the morning? Or are you brave enough to be watching this with the sun still up? Tell me. I read every comment. And if you have a story of your own, something that happened to you or someone you know that you have never been able to explain, leave it below or send it to us. You might end up being the next person whose story someone else needs to hear. All right. The lights are on. You are ready. Let us begin. Story 1, the abandoned military base that still has guards. Blake never believed in ghosts. That is the first thing you need to understand about him, and I mean really understand it, before any of what follows makes any sense at all. Not believing in ghosts was not for Blake a casual position. It was not the kind of thing where you say you do not believe in something but deep down there is a little flicker of uncertainty that flares up when you are alone in the dark. No. For Blake, the absence of belief in the paranormal was as fundamental and settled as his belief in gravity. It was not something he thought about because it was not something that required thought. The world was physical. Events had causes. Fear was a chemical response in a biological system. Period. You need to understand this about him because what happened to Blake matters more, cuts deeper, lands harder, when you understand the kind of man he was before it happened. Blake had grown up in rural Montana. And when I say rural, I mean the kind of rural where your nearest neighbor is 20 minutes of dirt road away. Where winters arrive like something with a personal grudge and stay longer than anyone wants them to. Where children grow up knowing how to fix an engine and read weather and navigate by landmarks before they know how to navigate by a phone screen. He was not soft. He had never had the luxury of being soft. He had grown up in the kind of place and the kind of family where softness was simply not a practical option. He had joined the army at 19. Served 8 years. 2 deployments to places he did not talk about at dinner tables. He had come back with a chest full of medals and a mind full of things that he had learned to file away in the specific mental filing cabinet that soldiers build for experiences that do not fit anywhere else. Not buried. Not suppressed. Just filed. Under the category of things that happened and are over and are not worth reopening. By his early 30s he had transitioned out of the military and built himself a second career that surprised everyone who knew him. Blake had become a photographer. Not the kind that shoots weddings or portraits or anything that required him to be personable at scheduled times. Blake had found his calling in abandoned places, forgotten buildings, structures that the world had moved on from and left standing. He called it urban exploration photography, and he had developed, slowly at first and then all at once the way these things sometimes go, a significant following online from people who shared his particular obsession with the beauty of things that have been left behind. He had spent 3 days inside a decommissioned psychiatric facility in upstate New York and come out with photographs that had made national publications reach out to him. He had shot abandoned hospitals in the Pacific Northwest, crumbling theaters in the rural South, a forgotten theme park in the Midwest that had been closed for 30 years and whose ride still sat frozen mid-rotation like a carnival dream that someone had simply stopped dreaming. He knew what abandoned felt like. He knew what empty looked like. He had been inside hundreds of structures that other people would never have set foot in, and he had never once felt anything that he could not explain. Fort Olcott changed that. Fort Olcott was not the real name of the base. Blake asked us to use a different name and to change certain identifying details because what he did that night was technically trespassing on federal property. He is not looking for legal trouble. He is just looking to tell the truth about what happened. And the truth is as follows. Fort Olcott was a military installation in the American Northwest. Built in the early 1940s, operational during a brief but intense period of the Korean War era, and officially decommissioned in the early 1950s when the government conducted one of its periodic assessments of strategic assets and concluded that the value of maintaining this particular base no longer justified its cost. Personnel were relocated. Equipment was stripped out and transferred elsewhere. Files were archived or destroyed depending on their classification. And the base itself, all 300 acres of it, was simply left, fenced off, padlocked, officially forgotten. Over the decades that followed, Fort Olcott had become something of a local legend in the surrounding area. The kind of legend that accretes slowly, one story at a time, each account adding a layer to something that already existed underneath. Hunters who came too close to the perimeter fence at night reported seeing lights moving through the old barracks buildings. Teenagers who dared each other to climb the fence came back. The ones who actually did it came back with stories of hearing footsteps on the gravel paths inside the perimeter. One local sheriff, a man Blake referred to in his account simply as Howard, had driven out to the base 3 separate times in the 1980s following calls from concerned citizens who had seen or heard something near the fence line. Each time Howard had found nothing. No evidence of trespassers. No fresh footprints in the dust. No signs of occupation. Just 300 acres of old buildings falling quietly apart inside their rusted fence. But the calls kept coming. By the time Blake found out about Fort Olcott, it had been sitting abandoned for over 60 years. He found it the way he found most of his locations, through a combination of urban exploration forums and local history groups and the occasional email tip from followers who knew exactly what kind of content he was looking for and wanted to point him somewhere worth going. A man Blake knew only by his username, we will call him Docwatcher because that is close enough to the actual name without being specific, had sent Blake a message in late October. The message was 4 sentences long. If you want the most haunted military location in the Northwest, look up Fort Olcott. I went there once. I'm never going back. Good luck. That was everything. No explanation. No backstory. No context for the I am never going back. Just those 4 sentences and a set of approximate coordinates. Blake should have asked more questions. He did not. He drove out on a Friday night in early November. This was standard practice for him. Arriving at an abandoned location after dark was how he got the atmospheric shots. The long exposures, the images where light and shadow did the kind of collaborative work they simply cannot do in daylight. He had done this hundreds of times before. He was not nervous. He was not apprehensive. He was in the same practical professional mindset he always brought to these trips. He had his camera equipment, his backup batteries, 2 flashlights with 2 extra sets of batteries each, a first aid kit, water. His old military-issue compass that he had carried out of pure habit since his service days, a talisman of routine more than anything practical. He parked his truck about a half-mile from the perimeter fence along an old logging road that the satellite maps had shown him. He put on his heavy jacket and his boots, shouldered his camera bag, and started walking through the tree line toward the base. It was cold that night. Clear. One of those November skies that happen when there is not a cloud anywhere to soften the darkness, where the stars come out in numbers that remind you how much you normally cannot see. His breath came in small white clouds. Dry leaves crackled under his boots with each step. Somewhere far back in the trees an owl called once and then went silent, as if it had thought better of drawing attention to itself. Blake reached the perimeter fence at approximately 11:15 p.m. The fence was old chain link, maybe 8 feet tall, topped with rusted barbed wire that had partially collapsed in several places along its length from decades of weather and neglect. Signs were posted at regular intervals along it, weathered to the point where the lettering had faded from sharp black to a pale gray that you had to angle your flashlight to read. United States government property. No trespassing. Authorized personnel only. Blake had seen signs like these before. He photographed them. The fence, the signs, the collapsed watchtower visible just beyond the perimeter with its rotted observation platform drooping at an angle like a tired shoulder. He worked his way along the fence until he found what he was looking for, a section where the chain link had pulled away from a support post at the base, pulled far enough away that a careful person could squeeze through if they were mindful of the lower runs of barbed wire that had sagged down into the gap. He got through without tearing anything, and the moment he straightened up on the other side of that fence, something felt different. He told us later that he struggled more with describing this part than with anything else in the story, because it was not a sound. It was not something he saw. There was no cold spot, no sudden drop in temperature, no hair standing on the back of his neck in the way that horror stories describe those things. It was subtler than any of that and in some ways harder to dismiss because of its subtlety. It was the air. The air inside the perimeter felt different from the air outside it. Not in temperature. Not in smell. Wait. In character. Like the way a room feels different when a storm is building on the horizon. That slight shift in atmospheric pressure that your body registers before your mind catches up to it. Except there was no storm. There was no visible change in the sky. There was nothing that could account for it. Just a feeling that the space inside that fence was fundamentally different from the space outside it. Blake was a practical man. He had spent 8 years training his mind to assess situations without letting his nervous system run ahead of the evidence. He noted the feeling. He dismissed it as his imagination responding to the environment the way imaginations do when you put them in an abandoned military base at 11 at night. And he moved forward. The base was laid out in the standard military configuration of its era. Central parade ground surrounded by administrative buildings. Barracks arranged in parallel rows behind that. A motor pool area to the east. An officer's quarters building to the north, slightly separated from the enlisted facilities by what had once been a manicured hedge and was now a dense tangled wall of overgrown shrubs that had not been maintained in decades. Everything was dark. Everything was still. Blake moved across the parade ground taking photographs. The crumbling flagpole still standing at the center of the parade ground, its rope long since rotted away but the pole itself still upright with a particular dignity given everything that had happened around it. The shattered windows of the administrative building catching his flashlight beam and throwing it back at him in fragments. The rusted fire escapes on the barracks buildings that corkscrewed down their exterior walls in graceful curves that had once been purely functional and had become, in their decay, something almost beautiful. His shutter clicked and clicked in the darkness. For the first hour, nothing happened. Nothing. He explored the administrative building. Floors thick with fallen plaster and dead leaves that had blown in through the broken windows over decades of autumn seasons. Filing cabinet drawers scattered across the floor, empty. Their contents long since removed or destroyed. A desk that someone had left behind, its surface warped and buckled from years of cycling through wet and dry, swollen beyond any practical use but still somehow standing. On the wall behind where the desk stood, barely visible under a thick coat of grime and moisture damage, a military training map of an area that no longer existed in any form Blake could identify. He photographed all of it. He moved to the first barracks building. Long rows of rusted bed frames standing in 2 parallel lines down the length of the building like the ribs of something enormous that had died standing up. The spaces between them had once been personal territories, the invisible walls that soldiers construct around their small piece of bunk and locker space. The quarters of young men who had slept and dreamed and cleaned their weapons and written letters home and argued about sports and wondered what they were going to do with their lives when all of this was over. None of them could have imagined this. Their barracks standing empty and collapsing 70 years later while a stranger with a camera walked through their sleeping spaces at midnight. Blake stood in the middle of the building for a moment and let himself feel the weight of that. Then he continued. He moved to the second barracks building. Same layout. Same rows of rusted frames. A section of the roof had partially given way near the far end, letting in a shaft of faint starlight that lay across the debris-covered floor like a pale stripe. He moved to the third barracks building. He was photographing a row of old metal lockers that still had name card holders in their doors, the cards themselves long since fallen out or deteriorated beyond legibility, when he heard it. Boots on gravel. He stopped moving the instant the sound registered. Not a conscious decision. Military instinct. Deep and old and reliable in the way that things are reliable when they have been trained into you over years. You hear something unexpected in a dark environment, you freeze, you assess. You do not give away your position while you are still gathering information. The sound was coming from outside. From the direction of the parade ground. Slow footsteps. Deliberate. Unhurried. The rhythmic fall of boots on gravel. Each step distinct and clear. The weight behind each one audible in the way that only substantial weight walking at a measured pace produces. Blake checked his watch. 12:47 a.m. His first assessment was rational and reasonable. Another urban explorer. Someone else who had found this location through the same online networks Blake used and had decided to visit on the same night. It happened occasionally in this community. Two photographers crossing paths in an abandoned building. Usually led to a brief conversation and then both parties going their separate ways. He moved carefully to the barracks window that faced the parade ground and looked out. The parade ground was empty. The gravel path running along the front of the barracks buildings was empty. He could see clearly by starlight and by the ambient glow his flashlight was throwing around inside the building. The path was empty in both directions as far as he could see. But the footsteps were still happening. Blake stood at that window for what he later said felt like a very long time but was probably no more than 2 or 3 minutes. He stood completely still. Completely silent. Completely focused. And he listened to those footsteps move from his left to his right along the gravel path directly in front of the building he was standing in. Slow. Steady. Unhurried. The footsteps of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Who had walked this path many times before. Who was in no particular rush to complete this particular circuit. He could hear the gravel shifting under each step. He could hear the weight behind each footfall. The specific compression sound of boots on loose stone. This was not his imagination reaching for patterns and ambient noise. This was not wind-moving debris. Blake had grown up in rural Montana and spent 8 years in the military. He knew what animal sounds were. He knew what wind sounded like moving through an empty building. He knew what his own mind sounded like when it was trying to frighten him. This was boots on gravel. A human being walking. Or something that moved exactly like one. On a path where there was nothing. The footsteps continued. Reached what he calculated to be the far corner of the barracks building based on the angle they had been traveling. And stopped. Silence. Blake let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Then from the direction of the parade ground, from somewhere behind him, a voice. Not words. Not a scream. Not a whisper. A voice speaking in a low, carrying tone. The specific kind of tone that a person develops after years of needing to be heard across open ground. A command voice. A parade ground voice. The voice of a man whose body had learned to project sound over distance without appearing to effort it. Blake spun around. The parade ground visible through the windows on the opposite side of the building was empty. The voice came again. Same low carrying tone. And this time Blake could almost make out words. Almost, not quite. The way you can hear someone speaking through a wall and catch the rhythm and shape of language without being able to make out specific words. The cadence of commands. The structure of orders being given. To no one visible. On an empty parade ground. In a base that had been abandoned for over 60 years. If you are subscribed to this channel, thank you. If you are not yet, look, I understand you want to keep listening right now and I respect that completely. But please take 5 seconds and hit that subscribe button. What we do here takes a lot of work and your subscription is how you tell us it is worth it. Hit the like button too. And keep watching because this is not even close to the most disturbing part of this story. Blake left. He was not ashamed to say so later. He was not embarrassed. He stated it with the particular precision that soldiers use when they are being accurate rather than dramatic. I did not run, he said. But I moved at a pace that would have satisfied most physical training instructors. He retrieved his camera bag. He moved to the barracks door. He checked the path outside, looked left and right along the length of the gravel, saw nothing, and started moving at a controlled but very deliberate pace toward the parade ground and the gap in the perimeter fence. He was halfway across the parade ground. He saw them. 2 figures. Standing at the far end of the parade ground. Near the base of the flagpole. Standing completely still. Facing him. Two figures in what he could only describe as military silhouettes. The upright posture. The boots. The shape of what appeared to be military attire. Perfectly still. Positioned like soldiers at attention. Standing in the middle of a parade ground at nearly 1 a.m. in a base that had been officially empty for over 6 decades. Blake stopped walking. He raised his flashlight and aimed the beam toward the figures. The beam reached the flagpole. He swept it left. He swept it right. Empty concrete. Dead weeds pushing up through cracks. Starlight. Nothing. He stood with his flashlight aimed at empty parade ground for several seconds. His hand was steady. He would make a point of that later. After everything, his hand had been steady. The training held even when the mind could not fully process what the eyes had just seen. Then he made the rational decision that this situation had moved well beyond anything his practical military mind was equipped to process on federal property at 1 a.m, and he left. He squeezed back through the gap in the fence. He walked quickly back through the tree line to his truck. He drove to the nearest town. He found a 24-hour diner and sat down in a booth with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, and he sat there until the sun came up through the window and turned the night outside from black to gray to the pale orange of early morning. He did not go back. He told the story first on his photography blog, then in a podcast interview, then to us. But here is what he found out afterward that transforms this from a photographer having a bad night into something that I want you to really sit with. When Blake started researching Fort Olcott's history in depth after the experience, looking for anything that might contextualize what he had felt and seen and heard, he found something buried in historical records that he had not expected to find. In the early 1950s, just months before the base was officially decommissioned, something had happened there. The records were incomplete. Some were still classified even now. But what Blake was able to piece together from what was publicly available was this. A platoon of soldiers stationed at Fort Olcott during a late-night training exercise in the winter of 1951 had filed an official report. Not an informal account. Not a rumor passed between soldiers. A formal, written, signed incident report filed through proper military channels. The report documented that the platoon had encountered during their training exercise figures moving through the training area. Figures that did not respond to challenges, did not identify themselves, did not halt when ordered, did not behave in any way consistent with personnel who had any business being in that area at that hour, and who vanished when approached. The commanding officer of the platoon had filed the incident report himself. It had been received, reviewed, stamped, and quietly filed away under a bureaucratic category that Blake translated, from the dry official language of mid-century military administration, as unresolved security incident. The base was decommissioned 6 months after that report was filed. Whether those two events were connected, Blake could not say. Whether what he experienced on that November night had anything to do with what those soldiers reported in 1951, he could not say. But he says this: I have been to over 200 abandoned locations in my career. I have never, not once, felt anything at any of them that came close to what I felt inside that fence. It was not just fear. Fear I understand. Fear is something your body does with information. This was different. It was like the air inside that perimeter had been soaked in something. Like whatever happened there stayed there. Like it never left. Like something was still walking that perimeter. Still running that parade ground. Still guarding a post that the army walked away from 70 years ago. He paused for a long moment. Whatever those soldiers experienced in 1951, I think they were experiencing what I experienced. I think whatever is there has been there since before the base was even abandoned. I think that is part of why it was abandoned. The photographs he took that night are on his hard drive. He has looked at 3 of them more times than he can count. 3 photographs of the empty parade ground, the empty gravel paths, the empty barracks buildings. In each of them, just at the very edge of the frame, just at the boundary between what the camera captured and what fell outside its range, there are shapes. He has run them through every analytical process he knows. He has shown them to other photographers, to people who know digital imagery the way mechanics know engines. No one has found evidence of editing. No one has found a technical explanation for the shapes. No one has been able to tell him what they are. He does not like to look at the photographs for too long. He does not like what the shapes seem to be doing. He has never been back to Fort Olcott. He does not intend to go back. And he has never, not since that November night, been able to fully dismiss the feeling that whatever is walking patrol inside that fence is still out there, right now, in the dark, following orders from a commanding officer who died before Blake was born. Take a breath. We have 2 more stories to get through tonight and I want you with me for all of it. If you are enjoying this, if you are feeling that specific combination of dread and fascination that tells you that a story has gotten under your skin, please hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear these stories. And drop a comment telling me where you are watching from tonight. I want to know. Now, Story 2. Story 2, the soldier who kept sending messages after he died. Tanner was the kind of soldier that every unit needed and not every unit was lucky enough to have. He was not the loudest man in the room. He never was. He was not the most physically imposing or the funniest at the bar or the one who attracted the most attention when a group of soldiers walked through a door. None of those things were Tanner. What Tanner was something quieter and in the long run much more valuable than any of that. He was the steady one. He was the man who was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing, every single time you needed him to be. No drama. No excuses. No variance. If Tanner said he would do something, it got done. If Tanner said he would be somewhere, he was there. If Tanner said he would find a way, well, that is what this story is about. He had grown up in a small town in rural Oregon. The kind of town that people who grew up in cities have trouble believing still exists. Where people leave their doors unlocked at night and know their neighbors by name and by the names of their neighbors' dogs and their neighbors' children's names and the stories behind all of those names. Where distance is measured in hours of driving rather than miles because miles means nothing if the road is dirt and winding and half of it washes out every spring. He had joined the army at 20 because it felt right and because the alternative was eventually taking over his father's hardware store and he was not ready for that yet. Not because he did not love his father or did not see value in the hardware store. Just because 20 years old is not when you are supposed to already know where you are going to spend the rest of your life. He wanted to see something else first. He wanted to earn something that was his before he inherited something that was his father's. He ended up staying in for 11 years. By the time the events in this story took place, Tanner was 31 years old, a staff sergeant, one of the most respected non-commissioned officers in his unit. The kind of NCO that younger soldiers tried to emulate not by copying specific behaviors but by simply trying to operate at the same level of consistent reliability. His squad was 7 men. They had been through 2 deployments together before this one. They had the kind of bond that only forms when people go through something genuinely difficult together. Not the artificial camaraderie of team-building exercises or mandatory social events but the real thing. The bond that forms in bad food and terrible sleeping conditions and shared fear and shared boredom. Which is its own category of suffering that civilians often underestimate. They had come out the other side of 2 deployments as something closer to brothers than colleagues. Garrett was Tanner's closest friend in the unit. Also 31. From a mid-sized city in Ohio. Loud where Tanner was quiet. Quick with a joke where Tanner was deliberate with words. The kind of complementary friendship that makes perfect sense once you see it even though you would never have predicted it on paper. They had been in the same unit for 6 years. They talked almost every day. They knew each other's families. They had stood up for each other in the specific ways that soldiers stand up for each other. Not just in the field but in the harder, quieter ways that do not get documented anywhere. It was Garrett who came to us with this story. And the first thing Garrett said when he sat down was, "I need you to promise me something before I tell you this. I need you to promise me that you will tell it exactly as it happened. Because I have told this story before and people have embellished things, added things. And I understand the impulse. I do. But what actually happened does not need embellishment. What actually happened is more than enough. We made that promise. Here is what actually happened." The deployment was in a region that for operational security reasons Garrett would not name specifically. What he could tell us was that the work involved long-range reconnaissance in difficult terrain. Small elements moving quietly through hostile areas. Gathering intelligence. Avoiding contact. Communicating back to base through encrypted radio channels and, when radio silence was required, through preset text message protocols on specialized military communication devices. 3 weeks into the deployment, Tanner's squad was assigned a mission. Garrett would not give us the specific details of the mission. Some of it is still classified. What he told us is that none of them were entirely comfortable with it. Not because they were afraid. These were experienced soldiers who had done hard things before, but because of a more specific kind of unease. The kind that experienced soldiers develop for missions where the intelligence supporting the plan feels thinner than it should be. Where the risk assessment feels like it was conducted by someone who was not going to be there when the plan met reality. They planned carefully anyway. They checked their equipment. They reviewed contingencies. They did everything that could be done. On the morning they were due to move out, Tanner said something to Garrett that Garrett did not think much of at the time but that he would spend years turning over in his mind afterward. They were doing a final equipment check. Garrett was checking his radio. Tanner was tightening a strap on his pack. Not looking up. Not changing his tone in any way that suggested he was about to say something significant. He said, "If something goes wrong out there, I'll find a way to let you know." Garrett had looked up. "What are you talking about?" Tanner had shrugged. Not uncomfortable. Not ominous. Just matter of fact. The way you say something you have already thought through and arrived at a settled position on. "I'm just saying. Something goes wrong. I'll find a way." Garrett had laughed. Because that was what you did when your friend said something weird right before a mission. You laughed it off and you moved on. Nothing's going to go wrong. Stop being weird. Tanner had smiled. That slightly delayed smile that was entirely his. The one where the joke registered a beat after everyone else's did and somehow came out funnier for the extra moment he gave it. He finished tightening the strap. Said nothing else. 2 hours later they moved out. 14 hours into the mission. In the early hours of the morning, something went wrong. The specific details of what happened remain partially classified. Garrett has respected that. What he told us is that the squad made contact with a hostile element. That the engagement was brief. That it was violent. That when it was over and the surviving members of the squad had fought their way to their extraction point, Tanner was not with them. 3 of the 7 men had been lost in the contact and the chaos of the immediate aftermath. Tanner was one of the 3. The 4 who made it to extraction were Garrett, a soldier they called Hudson who was from the South Island of New Zealand and had ended up in a unit full of Americans through a specialist exchange program that nobody in the unit had quite understood the administrative mechanism of. A Canadian soldier named Travis who was from somewhere remote and cold and almost never talked about it, and a 4th man whose name Garrett asked us specifically not to include. They were pulled out. Taken back to the forward operating base. The unit commander confirmed it. Tanner and the other 2 were listed as killed in action. Formal processes were initiated. Families would be notified. Garrett sat in his bunk that night, which was technically the middle of the afternoon local time because the mission had run through the dark hours, and he stared at the wall. He did not speak. He did not eat. He just sat there with the specific stillness of a person whose mind has received information that it has not yet figured out what to do with. After a long time he lay down. He did not sleep. The first message came 3 days later. Garrett was in the communications area of the base. Not for any particular reason. Not because he needed to be there. Just the aimless wandering that soldiers do when they are carrying something heavy and their bodies need to move even when their minds do not know where they are going. His unit used a specific military communication application on their authorized devices for non-classified internal coordination. Think of it as a secure messaging system. Squad members could communicate on practical matters without using formal radio channels. It was the kind of system that everyone used and nobody thought much about because it was just part of the daily operational infrastructure. A message came through on that system. He looked down at his screen. And the name at the top of the message was Tanner's name. Garrett would later describe that moment with a physical precision that I think tells you everything about how it landed. He said the feeling was exactly like missing the last step on a staircase in the dark. That specific lurching drop in the stomach. The instant of complete physical disorientation. Except it did not stop after a second the way that feeling does. It kept going. The message read, "North side of the ridge. Don't go back." He went immediately to the communications officer. No hesitation. He did not sit with it or try to process it or decide how to feel about it. Military training. Something anomalous happens. You report it. The comm officer pulled the message logs professionally and without visible reaction. The message had been sent from Tanner's assigned device at 2:14 a.m. local time. 3 days after Tanner was confirmed killed in action. The device had been logged as lost in the field. It had never been recovered. Its last confirmed active use had been during the mission itself. The comm officer's explanation was technical and plausible. Delayed message delivery due to compromised signal conditions during the mission. Messages queued on the device when no signal was available and then transmitted when the device subsequently came within range. Possibly as equipment in the area was disturbed by weather or by other parties. It happened sometimes with these systems. Not often. But it happened. Garrett accepted this explanation. He needed to accept it because the alternative was not something he was prepared to stand on top of yet. He filed it away. Queued message. Technical anomaly. Reasonable explanation exists. He went back to his bunk and tried to sleep. If you are watching this and you have not yet subscribed to this channel, I need you to pause for just a second right now, because we are about to get to the part of this story that made Hudson, a man who had surfed in waters that would terrify most people and come through 2 deployments with almost preternatural calm, go completely white. You do not want to miss what comes next. Subscribe, hit the bell, and keep watching. The second message came 2 days after the first. This time Garrett was not alone. Hudson was in the communications area with him. They had been there for about 20 minutes on unrelated business. Hudson was dealing with a routine administrative matter on his device. Garrett was doing the same. Nothing significant. Just the ordinary bureaucratic texture of military life continuing around the extraordinary thing that Garrett was carrying. Both of them saw the notification appear at the same time. Both of them looked down at their screens at the same moment. From Tanner's account. They're still there. They know about the north approach. Tell the commander. Hudson had gone completely white. Not pale. Not slightly off color in the way that people go when they receive bad news. Completely white. The color draining out of his face as visibly as if someone had pulled a plug. That is not a cued message, he said quietly. Garrett looked at him. The first message warned us about the North Ridge, Hudson continued. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that Garrett had never heard there before. We reported that to the commander. We specifically flagged the north approach in our debrief. That is in the official record now. That information did not exist anywhere in any form before we received the first message and reported it. He paused. This message is a response. It knows what we reported. Whatever is generating these messages, it knows about the debrief. Garrett took the second message to the commander directly. The commander was not a man who dismissed things. He was not a man who made rapid judgments in either direction. He looked at both messages. He read them carefully. He asked Garrett a series of precise questions. And then he had their technical specialists examine both messages in detail. The analysis took 2 days. The conclusion was inconclusive. Both messages had genuinely originated from Tanner's assigned device. Signal metadata confirmed that. The device's location at the time of transmission could not be precisely determined. The signal had bounced through too many relays for triangulation to be reliable, but both transmissions appeared to have originated from somewhere within the general operational area of the mission. The delay transmission theory for the second message was now difficult to sustain for exactly the reason Hudson had identified. Its content was specific. It was contextual. It referenced a specific approach to a specific ridge. It referenced information that had entered the official operational record only after the first message had been received and reported. A queued message from before the mission could not contain information about what happened after the mission. Nobody had an explanation. The commander quietly incorporated the intelligence from both messages into ongoing operational planning. The north approach to the ridge was officially flagged as potentially compromised. 3 weeks later, a different unit operating in the same area was directed away from that specific approach in their intelligence briefing. The approach was subsequently confirmed by independent intelligence to be heavily observed by hostile elements. Tanner's warning, from wherever it had come, had been accurate. Completely and specifically accurate. There was a third message. Garrett received it alone. It was the last night before the squad was rotated out of the operational area. He had spent the day packing his gear and doing the administrative work of transitioning and saying the specific kinds of goodbyes that soldiers say to each other when they do not know when they will see each other again. All the ordinary machinery of moving on. He found himself in the communications area late that night. He would say later that he did not know why he was there. That he had gone there without consciously deciding to go there. As if something had directed his steps to that specific room on that specific night. He sat down. He looked at his device. He waited without knowing what he was waiting for. And then his screen lit up. From Tanner's account. 3 words. Take care. Out. Garrett had to put the device down. He had to stand up and walk out of the room. Not because he was afraid. Because he was not certain in that moment that he could continue to hold himself together in a communications area where other soldiers might come in and need him to be functional. He went outside. He sat on the base's perimeter wall in the cold night air. He looked up at the stars. Out. Out was how Tanner ended every radio transmission. Every single one. Without variation. For 11 years. It was just his habit. His sign-off. His way of closing a communication channel. Every person in that unit, every person who had ever worked a radio alongside Tanner, would have recognized it instantly. It was not a military convention. It was Tanner's convention. His specific quirk is he kept his word, Garrett told us. His voice when he said this was steady. Not emotionless. Steady. There is a difference. He had been carrying this story for years by the time he brought it to us, and he had found a way to hold it that was not collapsing under its weight but was also not pretending the weight was not there. He told me before the mission that if something went wrong he would find a way to let me know. I laughed at him. I told him nothing was going to go wrong. And then something went wrong. And he found a way. 3 times. He found a way. He sent accurate intelligence. He followed up. And then he signed off the way he always signed off. Because that was Tanner. He finished what he started. He did what he said he would do. He was quiet for a moment. And he was right. About all of it. We have to be honest with you here. We cannot independently verify the technical specifics of this account. We have Garrett's testimony. We have Hudson's corroboration. We spoke with Hudson separately and his account of the second message matches Garrett's with a precision that is itself notable. We have the general framework of events. What caused those messages to appear? We cannot say with certainty. The technical explanations exist. Delayed transmissions. Possible interference or manipulation by hostile actors who recovered the device. Anomalies in the communication infrastructure. These are all possible. There are other explanations. The kind that a practical man from Oregon with 11 years of military service and a whole collection of reasons to be skeptical of the inexplicable would have found completely irrational before that deployment. When we asked Garrett directly what he believed, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at something in the middle distance, turning it over one more time. Then he said, "I believe Tanner sent them. I don't know how. I don't know what that means about what happens after we die or about the universe or about any of the questions I never used to think were worth asking. I can't give you a framework for it. I can't explain the mechanism. I just knew that man for 11 years. I knew how he talked. I knew how he thought. I knew exactly how he ended a radio transmission. And those messages were him. Whatever was left of him after that, Rich, it was enough. It was enough to do what he said he would do." He paused one more time. "And everything he told us was right. The intelligence was accurate. The warning was real. He was trying to help us. Even then. Even after. He was still trying to help." We reached out to Tanner's family. His father, who still runs the hardware store in Oregon, listened to the whole account. He listened without interrupting. Without expressing skepticism. Without trying to fill the silences with anything. When it was over he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That sounds like my son." He always finished what he started. He said nothing else about it. Sometimes that is all the words a thing needs. If you need a moment, take it. I mean that. This story has weight and you are allowed to feel that weight. When you are ready, we have one more story to go. The last one. And I am going to tell you right now that in some ways the last one is the most. I want to choose this word carefully. The most ancient. The oldest. The one that reaches furthest back. Because the last story does not involve one soldier or one base or one squad. It involves a field in northern France where thousands of men died. And where, according to the people who live nearby and to the researchers who have stood at its edge in the dark, they never stopped marching. Story 3, the battlefield where soldiers still march at night. There is a field in northern France that local people do not visit after dark. Not because of a law. Not because of a sign. Not because of any official designation or formal warning from any authority. Just because of an understanding that has been passed down through the generations of families who have farmed and lived in the villages near this place. An understanding that does not need to be explained in detail to children because it is simply part of the knowledge that gets transmitted from one generation to the next the way all the most important knowledge gets transmitted. By people who know better talking to people who do not know yet. The field is not remarkable to look at in the daytime. That is perhaps the strangest thing about it. Long and gently rolling. Bordered by old trees that have been there so long their roots have become part of the landscape. Cut through by a shallow stream that runs rust-colored in the wet months because of the concentration of iron in the soil. Iron that got into the soil the way it got into the soil. The grass grows thick and green over it. By day it looks like land. By night it is something else. The field was a battlefield. During the First World War, over 4 days in the autumn of 1918, thousands of soldiers fought and died on that ground. British, French, Canadian, American, German. All of the nationalities that the catastrophic arithmetic of that war had brought to that specific corner of France for those specific 4 days. It was not a famous battle. Not by the standards of that war where the scale of human destruction had become so overwhelming that individual engagements had to be extraordinary in their carnage to earn their own chapter in the history books. This was a relatively contained engagement. 4 days. Several square kilometers. The kind of battle that gets a paragraph in the broader accounts and then disappears into the general fog of the conflict. The ground was never fully cleared. Over 100 years later, farmers in the region still occasionally turn up battlefield debris when they plow. Unexploded ordnance still surfaces after heavy rains. The earth holds what was put into it. And the air. According to the people who live nearby, the air holds something too. Colby was 26 years old when he arrived in northern France as part of a historical research project associated with an American university. His specialty was battlefield archaeology, the study of conflict sites through physical evidence, soil analysis, subsurface mapping, the careful patient work of letting the ground tell you what happened on it. He had done field work at several major historical sites before this one. He described himself, and I want you to hold this description in your mind as the story progresses, as a hardcore skeptic. Not the aggressive kind. Not the kind who needs to argue about it at parties or who feels personally affronted when other people believe things he does not believe. Just the quiet, practical kind. The kind who requires evidence before belief and applies that standard consistently to everything, including the paranormal. I had been to a lot of battlefield sites before France, he told us. Gettysburg, the Normandy beaches, a site in Belgium. I had heard all the stories about all of those places. The sightings, the strange sounds, the photographs with shapes in them that no one could explain. I had never experienced anything at any of those sites that I could not explain. I felt the weight of history. I felt the appropriate solemnity of being in a place where people died. But nothing more than that. Nothing that crossed the line into something I would call unexplainable. He paused. France was different. Colby was working with a small team. For the purposes of this story, the relevant members were Colby himself, a French academic we will call Dr. Martin, who was in his 60s and had spent his career studying First World War sites across France and Belgium, and a research assistant named Bailey. Bailey was 23. She had grown up in rural Scotland before coming to university in the United States. Colby described her as the best research assistant he had ever worked with. He cited 2 qualities specifically, scientific rigor and open-minded curiosity, and said that the combination of both in the same person was rarer than most people appreciated. She was the first one to hear something. Third night of the survey work. The team had set up their base camp at the edge of the field. A cluster of tents and a larger canopy over their equipment and work tables. The nearest village was about 2 kilometers away through farm lanes. The night was overcast. No stars visible. A ground fog had settled into the lower areas of the field where the stream ran through, the rust-colored stream sitting in its shallow channel surrounded by pale fog in the darkness. Colby had gone to bed around 11. Long day. Early start required the next morning. He was asleep within minutes. He was woken at 1:30 a.m. Bailey was crouched at the entrance to his tent. Not panicked. Not distressed in any visible way. But very alert. Fully awake. Her expression was the one Colby associated with her when she had found something genuinely unexpected in the data. That particular combination of focus and careful restraint that kept her from jumping to a conclusion while also not dismissing what she was seeing. "I need you to come listen to something," she said quietly. He followed her out of the tent into the cool September night. The air smelled of wet earth and old grass and the specific mineral sharpness of the iron-heavy soil. The fog in the lower field had thickened since he had gone to sleep. He could see it sitting over the stream channel like something that had been poured there. Bailey pointed toward the field. "Stand still," she said. "And listen." He stood still. He listened. At first, nothing. Just the ambient sounds of rural France at 1:30 in the morning. Distant farm dogs responding to something he could not identify. The soft movement of wind through the trees at the field's border. The very faint sound of the stream over its stones. And then, footsteps. Not one set. Not two. Many. The rhythmic synchronized footfall of a large group of people moving in formation. That very specific cadence. Anyone who has ever marched in military formation knows it immediately because it is unlike any other sound. It is not the random footfall of a crowd. It is not even the sound of a group of people walking together casually in the same direction. It has an internal rhythm that is precise, disciplined, that has an architecture to it. The sound of many bodies moving as one body because they have been trained to, coming from the field, from the direction of the fog. Colby stood absolutely still. The The sound was clear, consistent. It was not the kind of sound that fades in and out as wind direction shifts, the way ambient sounds in the countryside do. It was directional, sustained, coming from a specific area of the field approximately 200 meters from where they were standing. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. "About 10 minutes, Bailey said. "I got up to check on the equipment. I heard it from here. I stood here for 10 minutes before I came to get you because I wanted to be sure I was not imagining it." Colby was a researcher. His first response to anything unexplained was to look for the rational explanation. Not because he was dismissing the experience, because finding the rational explanation first is how you establish whether one exists. He checked the wind direction. The sound was not being carried from any direction that could place its source outside the field. There were no roads nearby from which vehicle or pedestrian traffic could account for it. There was no machinery operating. The nearest farm was well over a kilometer away and nothing runs at 1:30 in the morning. He woke Dr. Martin. The French academic emerged from his tent looking mildly annoyed the way academics always look when they are woken at 1:30 in the morning. He stood in the cool air and blinked and was on the verge of saying something when the sound reached him. He stopped. He stood without speaking for a long moment. Then he said something in French that Colby did not entirely catch. Bailey translated it for him afterward. Dr. Martin had said, "So it is true then?" Colby asked him what he meant. Dr. Martin was quiet for a moment. He was a man who chose his words carefully and he was taking particular care now. "There are accounts," he said finally, "going back to the 1920s. Farmers who worked this land. People walking near this field at night. They hear this, the marching. Sometimes they say they hear voices giving commands. In French. In English. Sometimes in German." He paused. "I have spent 30 years working at First World War sites across France and Belgium. I have read all of these accounts. Every one of them. I always told myself they were folklore. Collective memory expressing itself through local legend. The living carrying the dead in the only way they knew how." He stopped. "I did not believe it was something you could actually hear." He looked out at the fog-covered field. "I believe it now." The three of them stood at the edge of that field for over 40 minutes. And during those 40 minutes, three things happened that moved the experience well beyond the category of ambiguous sound in the rural dark. The first was a voice. Approximately 25 minutes into their vigil, cutting through the rhythmic sound of marching with a clarity that made all three of them flinch slightly, a voice. Speaking in English. Not words they could completely make out. The cadence and character of a military command, short and sharp and designed to carry. The kind of voice that expects to be obeyed and has been given enough times that obeying it is almost a physical reflex. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then the marching continued. Colby retrieved his field journal from his tent specifically to document it. He noted the exact time. He wrote a detailed description of the sound quality and duration. He did this with the steady habitual precision of a researcher who knows that the documentation matters regardless of what the thing being documented turns out to be. The second thing was a light. Toward the far end of the field, in the thicker ground fog near the tree line that bordered the site on its northern edge, a light appeared. Not a flashlight. Not the solid directional beam of any modern light source. Something more diffuse. More amber-toned. Moving slowly. Moving as if carried in someone's hand. Moving parallel to the tree line in the general direction that the marching sound seemed to be traveling. They watched it for perhaps 90 seconds. Then it faded into the fog and was gone. The third thing was the hardest to describe. Colby described it as a change in the quality of the sound over a period of approximately 30 seconds. The marching did not stop abruptly. It did not fade the way a sound fades when its source moves away from you. It receded in a direction that made no geographic sense. As if the formation were moving not away across the field but down. Into the ground itself. Into the earth that held the iron-rich soil and the unexploded ordnance and the 17 sets of unburied remains that the ground-penetrating radar had located in the survey. And then it was gone. The field was quiet. The fog sat in the low places around the stream. The distant dogs had stopped barking. Just the wind. Just the sound of water over stones. Colby wrote the experience up in full in his field journal that night and in the official research log the following morning. He included it as an appendix in the final report of the research project with a clear notation that it was a witnessed anomalous experience and not a scientific finding. The three of them discussed it the following day over breakfast in the cool morning light of the French countryside. They never reached a consensus. Dr. Martin leaned toward an explanation he acknowledged freely sounded deeply unacademic coming from a man who had spent 30 years trying to be rigorous about these sites. These men died here, he said. Thousands of them. Over 4 days. The ground is full of them. We found 17 sets of remains in our survey. 17 men who have never been formally identified. Who have never been properly buried. Who are just here. In this field. In this soil. 100 years later. He poured more coffee. Perhaps they are still here in other ways. Perhaps the energy of what happened on this ground, the concentration of it, the intensity of it, does not simply dissipate. Perhaps it persists in ways we do not have the framework to understand. I am a scientist. I feel like a fool saying this. But I heard what I heard. And the accounts going back to the 1920s are consistent with what I heard. Which means, whatever this is, it has been here for 100 years. Bailey had the most interesting theory. Colby described it as the one he found himself returning to most often. She did not believe in ghosts in any traditional sense. She did not believe in residual consciousness or souls in any framework she could defend scientifically. What she believed, or what she was reaching toward, was something different. She thought it might be more like a recording. She thought that ground that had absorbed that level of concentrated human experience, that specific volume of fear and effort and violence and death over 4 specific days, might retain something of what happened on it. Not consciousness, not will, not the immaterial essence of specific individuals, just information. The way a landscape can be physically and permanently scarred by a geological event. She thought that a landscape might be informationally scarred by a human event of sufficient magnitude. And that under certain specific conditions, particular combinations of temperature and humidity and ground fog density and whatever other factors she could not yet identify, it plays back. Not because the dead are present, but because the ground remembers. Colby went back to the field the following night, alone. He sat at its edge from midnight to 3 in the morning. He heard nothing. He went back the night after that. With Bailey. Still nothing. On his last night in France, 5 days after the original experience, he went back alone one final time. He sat down at the edge of the field in the dark. The fog was back. The night was quiet. He sat with his hands in his lap and he thought about those 4 days in autumn 1918. About the men who had fought on that ground. British men and French men and Canadian men and American men and German men. Men from farms and cities and small towns. Men who had families waiting for them. Men who had never come back to those families. Men whose remains were still in that soil. 17 of whom the ground-penetrating radar had found and formally recorded and who would eventually be given the proper burial that had been owed to them for over a century. He sat with all of that for about an hour. And then it started again. Softer this time. More distant. As if the formation were farther away than it had been before, or as if whatever produced the sound were doing so at a lower register, more contained. But unmistakable. The same rhythmic synchronized footfall. The same disciplined cadence. Many people moving as one. He did not move. He did not retrieve his journal. He did not attempt to document it. He just listened. After a few minutes, the voice came again. Speaking English. And this time he was closer to understanding it. The words were right at the edge of comprehension. Right at the threshold between almost hearing and actually hearing. He sat absolutely still and leaned into the sound with every bit of his attention. He thought he made out 2 words. Keep moving. He sat there until the sound faded again into the quiet of the French countryside. Then he stood up. He walked back to camp. He packed his equipment for the return journey. He sat with his coffee and watched the sun come up over a field where the grass grew thick and green over soil that had been soaked in iron and history and something else that he still did not have a name for. He wrote this in his field journal that night. I came here as a skeptic. I leave as something more complicated than that. I don't know what I heard. I don't know what it means. I don't have a framework that accounts for it. But I know that field is not empty. Whatever is in it, whatever has been there for over 100 years, it is still keeping its formation. Still following its orders. Still moving through a battle that ended before my grandparents were born. He paused in his writing. Then he added one more line. God rest them all. The research project concluded. The team returned to their institutions. The data they collected contributed to the historical record. 17 sets of human remains were formally reported to the appropriate French authorities for eventual proper military burial. That process is still ongoing. The field is still there. Ordinary-looking by day, bordered by its old trees, cut through by its rust-colored stream. the grass growing green and thick and completely unremarkable in the morning light. And according to the people in the villages nearby, according to the farmers and the families who have lived near that field for generations, it is still not a place for the living after dark. Some places remember. Some places will not let themselves be forgotten. And some soldiers, seems, have not yet received the order to stand down. Thank you. Thank you from somewhere deep down for spending this time here tonight. I know that was a long journey, and I want you to know that every single moment of it was something I gave everything to. These stories matter to me not as content to be created and distributed, but as real accounts from real people about experiences that sit at the very edge of what we understand about the world we live in. The abandoned base where something still walks patrol 70 years after the last human guard went home. The soldier who kept his promise from beyond the ridge and whose intelligence saved lives after he was gone. The battlefield in northern France where the grass grows over unburied men who have been marching through the fog for over 100 years. These stories deserve to be told carefully. And you deserve to hear them told that way. So now I want to hear from you. Which of the 3 stories tonight got deepest under your skin? Drop it in the comments right now. Was it Blake and the footsteps on the gravel at the abandoned base? Was it Tanner and his final 3 messages in that last sign-off? Or was it the French battlefield where the soldiers still keep their formation in the dark? Tell me which one you are still thinking about. And I have a question for you. If you were Garrett, if you were sitting in that communications area on the last night before rotation, and your screen lit up, and it said, "Take care. Out," what would you have done? I genuinely want to know. Tell me in the comments. Tell me what you want to hear next. More military horror. More abandoned locations. More accounts from soldiers who experienced the unexplainable. More battlefield history from places where the history did not stay in the past. This channel goes where you want it to go. If you have a story, and I know some of you do because you have told me before, you have left comments that made me sit at my desk for a long time afterward. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. Your story might be the one that makes someone else feel less alone with something they experienced and could not explain and have been carrying by themselves ever since. Email us or leave it below. And if you have not subscribed yet, you watched this entire thing. You know you are coming back. Make it official. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the like button. Hit the bell. Every single one of those things helps this channel reach more people who need to hear these stories. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching until the very end. That means everything to me. Stay safe out there. And whatever you do, do not go near old military bases after dark. Do not stand at the edge of fields in northern France when the fog comes in. And if someone who should not be able to send you a message sends you a message, read it carefully. They might be trying to tell you something important. Good night.